Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the campfire. I'm your host, Robert Lee, and this is Outside the Light. If this is your first time here, welcome to the fireside. And for those of you who are returning, I'm happy you've come back to join me. I start every episode by saying this: we tell scary stories here, so some stories may be disturbing or contain graphic content. If that's something you want to hear, then grab a seat and lend me your ears. If it's not, then turn back now. But be careful when leaving the glow of the campfire, because you never know what's outside the light. Our first story tonight is entitled Santa Came for My Neighbor by Alex T. This all happened about 2 years ago, right around Christmas. It was a quiet night, just like any other, or so I thought. My name's Alex, I'm 32, and I live in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and you can leave your doors unlocked without worrying about anything. Or at least, that's what I thought. The night started like any other holiday evening. It was December 22nd, just a few days before Christmas. My wife Sophie and I had just finished dinner and we were sitting on the couch, watching TV. It was a peaceful evening. Our kids, Jamie and Lily, were upstairs, already tucked into bed, and everything just felt right. Christmas music played softly in the background, and I couldn't help but think how good it felt to be home from work. We live in a 2-story house, and our living room faces the street. From where I was sitting, I could see the outside, especially the houses across the road. There's this one neighbor, Mr. Thompson, who lives just a few houses down. He's an older guy in his late 60s, and he's always been friendly, but he's a bit of a loner. His wife passed away a few years ago, and I don't think he ever fully recovered from it. I often see him sitting on his porch or taking his walks around the block, but for the most part, he keeps to himself. I had just turned my attention back to the TV when I noticed something outside. At first, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. There was a figure standing in Mr. Thompson's front yard. It was dark, but there was enough light from the street lamps to make it out. It wasn't moving at first, just standing there, staring at the house. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just some stranger walking through the neighborhood, or even one of Mr. Thompson's friends visiting. But the longer I watched, the more I realized something was off. The figure was wearing a full Santa Claus costume. Red suit, white beard, everything. It struck me as strange. Why would anyone be walking around dressed as Santa on a random Tuesday night, especially this late? I glanced at Sophie, who was still watching TV, and then back at the figure. It was still standing in Mr. Thompson's yard, and now I could see that it wasn't moving at all. It looked like it was just waiting. I tried to shake it off, but the sight of that person just standing there started to make me feel uneasy. I couldn't help but watch him, trying to make sense of what they were doing. After what felt like forever, the figure finally moved. Slowly, they started walking towards Mr. Thompson's house. Their movements were deliberate, slow, almost like they were walking in a trance. I don't know why, but I felt a strange knot in my stomach. I told Sophie, "Hey, do you see that? There's someone out there in a Santa suit." She glanced outside, but didn't seem as concerned as I was. "Maybe it's a Christmas prank," she said, rolling her eyes. "People are always doing weird stuff around the holidays." But it didn't feel like a prank to me. There was something about the way the figure moved, like it was not in a hurry, but kind of determined. They stopped at the edge of Mr. Thompson's porch and stood there for a few seconds, just looking at the door. I don't know why, but something clicked in my head. I should have done something. I should have gone over there, checked on Mr. Thompson, or at least called him to make sure everything was okay. But I didn't. I just watched. Then the figure knocked on Mr. Thompson's door. It wasn't just a quick knock either. It was a loud, heavy knock, and it kept going like they were trying to get Mr. Thompson's attention. The whole thing just felt wrong. Why would anyone knock like that on a random door at night, especially dressed as Santa? I watched for another minute, and when nothing happened, the figure turned and started walking away. I didn't think much of it at first, but as they reached the end of the driveway, something strange happened. The figure stopped, turned back around, and went up the steps straight back to Mr. Thompson's porch again. This time, I got up from the couch. "I'm gonna call the cops," I said, walking towards the phone. Sophie gave me a puzzled look. "What for? It's just some weirdo in a costume." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whole thing just felt off. Why would someone knock so persistently on Mr. Thompson's door and then walk away only to go right back? It didn't make any sense. But before I could make a call, the figure knocked again, this time harder, like they were determined to get inside. But it wasn't just a knock this time. The guy forced the door open and ran inside. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing. Sophie looked at me and said, "Call the cops, now!" I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. I told them what I'd seen, that I thought someone might be breaking into Mr. Thompson's house. But by the time I hung up, the figure had disappeared into the night. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. I didn't know what they could do. By then, whoever it was had already left. But I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Thompson. I stood at my window watching the cops walk up to his porch and knock on the door. It wasn't long before they came back to their car looking confused. They went back and knocked again, but there was still no answer. After a few minutes, they made their way inside the house. The police rushed out, and a few minutes later they had the whole block roped off. Sophie and I were standing at the window, too scared to go outside. We could see officers going in and out, carrying evidence bags, and at one point I saw someone come out with a stretcher. We found out what happened a couple days later. The police had discovered Mr. Thompson's body inside the house. He had been brutally attacked, and the killer dressed in that Santa suit had murdered him. The Santa suit was a disguise, of course, but what shocked everyone was how carefully the crime had been planned. The killer had apparently been stalking Mr. Thompson for weeks, learning his habits and waiting for the right moment. It turned out that the man in the Santa suit was someone from Mr. Thompson's past, someone who had known him for years. The police investigation revealed that this person had been living just a couple streets over from our neighborhood and had seen Mr. Thompson on one of his nightly walks. They had been waiting for the perfect opportunity, and that night, they finally acted. Mr. Thompson was found in his living room, shot at point-blank range. The killer had even staged the scene to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but the police quickly saw through that lie. They found fingerprints, but it was a Santa costume that led them to a breakthrough. The killer was arrested a couple days later. It turned out to be a man who had been working for Mr. Thompson in the past. He had become bitter over a financial dispute that had happened years ago, resulting in his wife divorcing him and losing his retirement. And after all that time, he decided to take matters into his own hands. The Santa costume was a way to mask his identity and avoid suspicion. When the news came out, it shook our entire neighborhood. How could something like that happen right under our noses? Someone we all thought we knew, and someone who was living just a few streets away, had been capable of such violence. Even now, 2 years later, I still feel uneasy when I look outside at night. The memory of that Santa figure standing in Mr. Thompson's yard will haunt me forever. It's hard to shake the feeling that somehow we all missed the signs. I keep wondering if I could have done something. If I had just called the cops sooner or gone over to check on Mr. Thompson, would I have made a difference? I'll never know, but I'll never forget the night that Santa came from my neighbor. If you'd like to help us create creepy content, we're looking for volunteer narrators that would like to lend their talents to help make amazing stories come to life for all of our listeners. If that sounds interesting to you, then send us an email at outsidethelightstories@gmail.com. Also, there have been several of you who have reached out to us to see how they can help support us. So if that's something you'd like to do, you can buy me a coffee to keep me awake, so that I can stay up making creepy content for everyone around the campfire. The link to buy me a coffee is in the show's description. Our second story tonight is entitled, Something Was Watching Us at Our Christmas Cabin by Stacy R.
I still can't believe what happened to us that weekend. It feels like a bad dream, and I can't shake the images from my mind. I've never been one to tell creepy stories or anything like that, but what we experienced was too real to ignore. This happened last Christmas, and it's been haunting me ever since. I'm sharing this here because I have no idea who else to talk to about it. We were all excited about our family trip to the cabin that year. It was the same place we've gone to for years, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by dense woods. We always go to this cabin for Christmas, a tradition that started long before I was born. It's become a time for the family to unplug, unwind, and enjoy each other's company. No phones, no distractions, just the peace and quiet of the mountains. It was the perfect getaway from the city, especially during the holidays. It was me, my husband Kyle, and our 2 kids, Ava and Ben. We were going to meet up with the rest of our extended family. We drove up on Christmas Eve, the snow falling gently as we made our way up the narrow, icy road to the cabin. The place is pretty far from the nearest town, so when we're there, it feels like we're completely isolated from everything. But that's part of the charm, right? It's the kind of place where you don't see anyone for days, and you can relax in the silence. We arrived late in the evening, and by the time we got everything unloaded and settled in, it was already dark outside. The only light came from the cozy fireplace inside and the soft glow of Christmas lights on the tree. We all sat around the living room, enjoying some hot cocoa, and talked about the usual stuff, holiday plans, old memories, and just catching up. But something about that night felt different. Maybe it was just the cold, but there was this strange feeling in the air, like we weren't as alone as we should have been. I didn't want to say anything at first, thinking it was just me being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, Christmas Day, everything seemed fine. We spent the day hiking through the snow, playing games, and just enjoying the time together. It was beautiful out, clear skies, untouched snow everywhere. We had a great time, but I kept noticing strange things on the edges of our hikes. Small tracks in the snow leading off into the woods. They weren't like animal tracks I'd seen before. They were too large, and they seemed to have this irregular pattern to them. When I pointed it out to Kyle, he shrugged it off. "Probably just a big deer or something," he said. But I didn't feel convinced. I couldn't quite explain it. But the way the tracks seemed to go in random directions didn't sit right with me. That evening, we decided to stay inside and have a nice family dinner. We were all laughing and talking when, around 9 p.m., I heard something outside. It was faint at first, but it sounded like something moving around. The snow outside had stopped falling, so the silence was intense. I remember looking out the window, trying to see if I could make out anything in the dark. I didn't see anything, but that feeling from the night before started creeping in again. That sense of being watched. The rest of the night passed without anything else happening, but I couldn't shake that feeling. And I should have said something, but I didn't want to freak out the kids. By the time we all went to bed, I convinced myself that I was just being silly. The real trouble started the next day. We woke up to a strange noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too consistent. It was almost like something was tapping against the side of the cabin. I didn't want to go outside, so I just stayed in bed for a while, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. When I finally mustered up the courage to peek out of the window, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, standing just at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It was tall, too tall, and it was covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. I couldn't make out its face, but I could tell it was watching us. I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if this was some kind of prank or if we were just imagining things. I quickly told Kyle, and he went outside to check it out. I stayed inside with the kids, telling them it was nothing, trying to sound calm, but inside, I was anything but. Kyle came back a few minutes later, saying he didn't see anything. He assumed it was an animal, maybe a bear or a large elk, but it was still unsettling. The whole situation didn't sit right with me, though. Why would something be so close to the cabin, and why did it feel so deliberate? The day went on. Everyone else went home that day. We decided to stay one more night and put the unexplainable things out of our minds. But the unease only grew. That evening, as we were having leftovers for dinner, I noticed something strange outside again. The tracks from the day before were back, only this time they were much closer to the cabin, leading right up to the door. I didn't want to make anyone panic, but my gut was telling me that something wasn't right. I stayed up late that night, staring out the window, waiting to see if I'd catch a glimpse of the thing again. But nothing happened. The next day, things took a turn for the worse. We were all planning to leave the cabin and head back home, but when we tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn over. The engine was completely dead. At first, we thought it was just a mechanical issue, so Kyle went to check the engine. But when he opened the hood, we saw something that made my blood run cold. The engine had been tampered with. The wires were cut, and there were large, claw-like marks all over the hood. The tracks from the day before were right next to the car, leading off into the woods again. I felt sick. This was no accident. Whatever was out there was targeting us. But what could we do? We were stuck, and the nearest help was miles away. Kyle did the best he could to repair the damages to the vehicle and actually got it working again, but by the time he was done it was already getting dark, so we decided to stay tonight and leave in the morning. That night, things got even worse. I woke up to the sound of something pounding against the cabin, like someone, or something, was banging on the walls of the cabin. I was terrified. My heart was pounding as I grabbed the kids and pulled them into our bedroom. Kyle was already up, trying to figure out what was going on. I could hear him yelling at whatever it was outside, but then everything went silent. The silence was worse than the noise. I sat there in the dark, clutching my kids, not knowing what to do. It felt like we were trapped in a nightmare. Around midnight, we decided to make a run for it. Kyle got the flashlight and tried to lead us toward the vehicle, but as we stepped outside, we saw something that made me freeze in my tracks. The car was completely destroyed. The tires were slashed and the windows were shattered. The hood was smashed in, and the tracks around it were unmistakable. Large, clawed prints, leading off into the woods again. We were stranded, and whatever had been watching us was still out there. The next few hours were a blur of panic. We stayed inside, barricading ourselves in, but nothing happened after that. The creature, whatever it was, didn't return. The next morning, we managed to walk out to the main road and flag down a passing car to take us back to town. The police investigated, but they couldn't find any trace of what had happened. They thought it was a bear at first, but no bear would have destroyed a car like that, and the tracks didn't match any known animal. We've never gone back to the cabin. I don't think I ever will. I still don't know what it was, some kind of animal maybe, but it felt more like a deliberate stalking. I don't think it was just looking for food. It was watching us, and it knew we were there. I'm just thankful nothing happened to us.
If you enjoy what you've heard tonight, consider liking and subscribing wherever you're listening from. We plan to release multiple stories for you every week. If you have a story to share about something creepy that's happened to you or your family, please email us at outsidethelightstories@gmail.com so that we can share it with other members of the campfire. Well, everyone, the fire is dying down, and it looks like our time together is drawing to an end. Thank you for joining me tonight. I ask as you begin to leave, please give us a follow or subscribe, leave us a review or comment, and share us with your friends. There's always more room by the campfire. As you leave the last light of the dying embers and return to your lives, remember to be wary of what could be lurking in the shadows, because you never know what may be outside the light.